So why are we here? We ask principals to select people who would be leaders of a planning effort at the local school. The idea was to bring everyone together to explain sort of the rationale behind this planning initiative that the bishop announced through a letter that went to parents, to give the rationale and sort of make sure that everybody was starting in the same place and with the same information. Now, many of you may have been at your school presentations where we gave the principals data to share that was really school-specific. Our goal now is to give you more diocesan-wide perspective, because the goal of this planning initiative is not just school-specific, but really to look at the entire system. This planning process is an outgrowth of the strategic plan that was issued back in 2017. Some of you may recall, as I'm sure you read it cover to cover, we talked about the idea of looking at schools to ensure operational vitality and to ensure excellence in every school. It's also an outgrowth of a recognition of significant change in Fairfield County. It's a change being felt really throughout all the Northeast. Most every one of my colleagues is having similar conversations in their diocese. And that is the result of demographic change in terms of school-age population, financial picture, and really a commitment on the part of many people to the faith and a difference in why they choose our schools than perhaps they may have in the past. We felt they needed to evaluate the long-term viability and sustainability of our current model, our system of schools in the diocese, to ensure viability, sustainability, and to look at models given all of the changes that we face. And then really to provide the individual school the opportunity to discern their own future and ask, what can education look like in our school, and how can we differentiate ourselves in a shrinking market? So that's the rationale behind all this. Who's leading it? It's being led by the Education Commission at the diocesan level. The Education Commission is a group that was formed to provide advice and support to the bishop and to the office of the superintendent. They were involved in the creation of the strategic plan, and there have been a number of committees that have started over the course of the years since the strategic plan was released to address some of the goals of the strategic plan. Early, I don't remember the exact time, but maybe the end of last year, the bishop came to the commission and asked them to take a look at sort of the whole system. And I would say that this was as a result of not only what the bishop has seen, but what the commission has seen in their involvement in schools. That as we focus on individual schools, and we look at trying to support schools that are struggling, have we neglected to look at the entire system? And instead of focusing on individual schools, to look at them as part of a larger system to ensure that while we may have shrunk in size, to remember that there are still 5,000 elementary school kids in our diocese that we have a responsibility to. So that's the rationale. He asked us to create 5 committees. A school viability committee. The school viability committee was designed specifically to look at schools who were struggling significantly. And we had to define that. So we did a lot of back and forth of how do we choose these schools, and finally we said, you know what, let's look at it, let's pick a number, 200. Because if you look at 200 and you break that down per grade, schools that are under 200 are probably struggling. So that's where we drew the line. And every school under 200 met with the bishop, myself, and received a set of benchmarks. The School Viability Committee will start their visits next week to sort of check in with the schools to see how they're doing towards those benchmarks. Once a school reached its benchmarks, and if a school reached its benchmarks, they would move into school planning. And that's the process we're here to discuss really tonight. The other three groups, the next one, educational and structural models. That was tasked to look at, obviously, what it says, different educational models, different structural models. I'll talk more about that later. To look at how we develop leadership, not just school leadership at the immediate school level, but also board leadership, pastoral leadership, and so forth. And the idea of a mission school, of developing a mission school status to look at areas of the diocese in which students might not be able to have a choice of Catholic education without this support. This is the commission membership. You'll see, maybe, if you can see it, if you can. If not, you'll see it when you get an email. The commission consists of members both of the Office of the Superintendent, leaders of local universities, professors in universities, current and former school leaders, former public school superintendents, finance people, etc. So we try to have a varied representation of people who look at the school system. The first thing that the commission looked at was demographics. So as we began this planning process, we looked first at demographics. If we look at the school-age population in Fairfield County, and you look starting from 2010 to now, you see a decrease in all of these age groups, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, 15, 17. If we look specifically at this number right here, this is the 5 to 9-year-olds. It's about, quick math, I think it was about 12.5%, 13% decrease since 2010. If we look to what the next 5 years bring, is projected to bring, we see a decrease, a continued decrease in those numbers. So the commission began to look at this information and then said, well, what does that mean for us? How does this compare to where we are? And I think it's interesting to note before we look at that, almost all of you have probably seen in your own local newspapers the challenges that public schools are facing because of this demographic change. Every school, for the most part, is dealing with this. In fact, there was an article, I think it was in the Connecticut Post? Connecticut Post talking about Fairfield, right? They're looking, I had the article, and I meant to bring it down sitting on my desk, but it talked about the challenges they're facing and how they don't expect that to turn until I think it was like 2028, where they expect to see a turn. So this issue, this challenge, is not specific to us. And many of the challenges we face are a symptom of this challenge, a result of this challenge. So how does this affect us? If we look at our current enrollment trends, pre-K to 8, system-wide, in the past 5 years, our enrollment in the elementary schools, pre-K to 8, has dropped about 20%. Because not only are we challenged by the school-age demographics, but even in cities or towns where that population is stable or growing, it's a population that either can't afford or traditionally does not choose Catholic education. So the challenge gets sort of exasperated. How is that broken down? We did K to 8 because pre-K there are so many configurations. But if you look at K to 8 enrollment, this is the entire diocese, elementary schools, K to 8. And to me, the most significant and obvious alarming piece to this is when you look at 7th and 8th grade and compare that to K and 1. What we're noticing is that for the most part, once parents are in our system, kids are in our system, they stay. But the number of new students that are coming in is declining significantly over time. So to me, this is a very, I think, very concerning number. And the result of this, unfortunately, has been significant deficit throughout the diocese. So, if you take a look at this, let me explain what this is. This is the total of all the elementary school deficits. Is it just elementary? Yes. Elementary school deficits in the diocese over the past 6 years. For a 6-year total of $8.2 million. This does not mean that some schools haven't made a surplus. There are some that have, but remember, it's not a pool of money that we share. It's specific to the schools. Right? Every school has its own budget. So if you... Yeah, so this reflects the deficit. So the accumulated deficit of all the schools, some of which are covered. I would say there are 2 schools in the diocese who have been able to cover their deficits. The rest of this is covered by the diocese.
That's strictly operating expenses?
Yes.
Has nothing to do with any cost that might be passed on from shared services that happen in the office and all that.
This is the entire operating budget of the school. So traditionally, I'm trying to think what has been passed down as a shared service fee. That would be included in this. Now, there are almost all of the schools. So what this doesn't include is every school is allotted, it comes out to about $30,000 of services that are provided. Those are the shared services. So, Rediker, the student information system, the school doesn't pay for that. That's part of that $30,000 number. Marketing, our marketing costs, the schools don't pay for it. So I'm trying to think if there's a specific pension. Yep, that's an operating because it's the teachers. That would be a shared service. That would just be a cost. That's across every entity in the diocese. That's a piece of this. Correct. Okay, so this also does not capture, for example, in the projected number, the money that is given to schools to make sure that their medical benefits are whole for this year. So anyway, $8.2 million total annual deficits across the schools. We also did, to try to get the parent perspective, we did a parent survey, which is kind of hard to capture all the different pieces in one survey, but we tried. We put it out. We had about almost a 40% return, which is actually pretty good. And what we found is that for the most part, parents are happy. They like the schools the way they are. Most prefer the PA model. There's a strong interest in the personalized learning approach that we've begun in the schools. Most parents don't understand the true cost of educating a student. That came out in many of the comments. So for example, if you take what it actually costs to educate the student and compare that to what you charge in tuition, there's a gap. Forget the full budget deficit and all that, but automatically you start with a gap. That's usually made through fundraising or if there is a deficit in diocesan support. Most parents don't understand that. They think their tuition covers everything. And I find that when I go and talk to parents, that's the first question. Well, what's happening? Where's our tuition going? So I think that's something we have to do a better job of educating. And then the other point that came up is how we use technology to make sure that as we integrate technology into the schools, we do so in a way that is supportive of the teacher, and provides additional opportunity, for example, programming, robotics, and not replace the teacher. So that was one of the things that came to the survey. What I'm about to show you, you're not going to be able to read. Let me tell you what it says. This is if you take the survey responses, I'm trying to figure out the best way to show this. This is what is essential and what is absolutely essential. Absolutely essential and essential, that is teal and orange. Okay? A couple of things jump out as we look at this, but I'm going to point to two. One is that if you look at things like tailored instruction, personalized learning plan, STEM, mastery learning, that kind of thing, the idea of mastery versus get it done, and that all of these things are extremely important. And all of them, I was kind of happy to see that because all of them fit into the model that we've been putting out in schools. And so that was the idea of tailored instruction, personalized learning plan. The other thing I found interesting was this, that parents want the facts in elementary school. But then as students move up in middle school, they want them to be challenged more, using logic, critical thinking, and then into high school discussion, debate, use of the classics, things like that. So this would be like the high school level sort of a great books type of logic. So I thought that was interesting. Again, you'll get this in the email. Our next step is we have to then figure out, we captured to some degree by a 40% return rate what our parents were thinking. Now we need to reach beyond that and see for those who choose not to send their children to our school, how do they feel about these things? So that's our next step. Some of that will be done most effectively at the local level. So, all of that leads us and informs this planning process. I talked about the school viability process already, so I won't talk more about that. As we move through this planning process, we talked about, when I met with the principals, we talked about models. Trying to be new, innovative, creative, that this was the time to be bold, to be creative, to look at new things. Does not mean that every school has to have a new model in September or the year after. It's not what this means. It means to look at some of the best practices of models and see what can be incorporated into what we're doing. And some schools may choose a specific model to go, for example, to a classical school model with a focus on the Greek books, or to go to a stream model. Science, technology, religion, engineering, arts, math. To go to a model that's project-based, a really different model of curriculum, different pedagogy, etc. Some schools may choose to go in a completely different direction than where they are, to differentiate themselves. So that's possible. Some may look at an IB program, International Baccalaureate for middle school, or maybe not high schools. Some may look at a dual language immersion, and so forth. That's the conversation that we want to start happening at the school level in this planning process. The other thing we want to look at is structural models. There are some schools who are struggling to keep a science and math program for a limited amount of middle school kids. Does it make sense for some schools to become pre-K to 5, pre-K to 6? Maybe not. Does it make sense for some high schools to go 7 to 12 and look regionally, as I note here, that would require some regional discussion, because that would have an effect on the elementary school. How do we look at governance differently? Some schools have moved to the academy model, board of directors. Do we look at that? How do we look at more shared services? So right now, some of our schools, for example, share bookkeepers or share accounting firms. But are there other things we can do? Can we create centers of excellence that focus on marketing, focus on advancement, and maybe 3 or 4 schools share one advancement person across the diocese, or marketing person, or whatever. Those are the kind of conversations that we want people to start with. What's the timeline for this? Well, we've begun some of it already, November, December. We had the schools for under viability review. We had them in. In December, when the bishop announced this and sent out the letter, one of the obvious concerns we had was that some people would read that letter and panic. Some, rightly so. They have a reason to panic. Others not. Although I think everybody has a reason to be concerned when we look at almost every school. I think even the ones who would say, we're very strong, we have a great budget, things look great, we have great programs. When you look at the numbers, everyone should be planning. Some of our schools have started strategic planning process. All of this will filter into it. Doesn't mean they start over. So when that letter went out, sorry, I digressed for a minute there. When that letter went out, we knew that concern would happen. So the bishop asked me to ask every principal to hold a parent meeting in December to address clearly what that letter said and what it meant. And so we created a template. Those of you who are at the meeting will recognize this was the basic template. We gave it to principals and said, use this data as a template, add your own information, and present that to families. With the hope that we wouldn't scare people, but perhaps we could engage people in new and creative ways that we haven't before. And by giving the freedom to schools to be creative, to sort of be bold in their direction. So we've started meetings with some schools already. Some schools have come to us and looked at different plans, or not so much plans. They've looked at different models, a better way to say it. They looked at models and said, we might be interested in this, we can get more information. We will be providing professional development to the principals at the next meeting in March on 2 or 3 different models. We'll have guest speakers for them to talk a little bit about what this model looks like in school so that they'll have more information. With the hope that over the next 2 months or so, schools will have some good conversations about what do we think, what are the possibilities. There's a planning group from the commission that will begin to meet with these planning teams. As they meet with them, ideas will sort of percolate up and try to get a sense of what people are doing, and the commission will make some recommendations to the bishop. And that will be what I'm going to refer to as sort of the first phase of recommendations, because you're all not going to plan your future in 2 months. But we'll have some ideas, and those we'll have some conversations then at the commission level and make some recommendations to the bishop. I think I also have to be very honest and say that some of those recommendations could include that schools that had certain benchmarks to meet did not meet them, will probably not be able to meet them. And we have to look seriously at how we deal with that and how we best utilize the resources to serve the 5,000 kids that remain. For late February, for those recommendations, there won't be complete recommendations, but sort of a first round of this is what we're thinking. And then the bishop, if there's enough sort of definitive answers, the bishop will make, I'm assuming sometime in March. I think the target was March 15th. That's my birthday, so I'm hoping that's not the day, in case it's bad news. Sometime in March, the bishop will give sort of that first round of this is where we are at this point in the planning process. I don't think it will be a definitive, this is where everybody's going and doing, because I don't think you can do that in 2 months, but I think you can come up with this is where we are right now. And this is what we expect to happen. And then there'll be follow-up meetings. We continue to meet, the different committees meet more often, and then the commission meets more. So, what now? Why are you here? What's your role? You've been selected by your principal to be a part of this process. And we ask that you now go back and work, if you haven't already, some of you already have your planning committees, you're already going. If you haven't already, fully develop a planning committee and begin to look at some of the different educational model research that we'll have available to you. Begin to look at survey your parents and parish, discuss structure, and have serious discussions about, should our school look different? Structure. Would it make sense? Would we be stronger? Sometimes I feel like we've tried to be all things to all people in all places, and in the long run I think that's hurt us because it's sort of diluted what we've been able to do. Rather, if we look at what we can really do well and build on that, I think we'd be in a much better position. I think we have to break out finances. Pat Saccone will be meeting, if she hasn't already, I know she's met with some of you, she'll be meeting with board members, the planning team members. First, board members, really to look at schools with deficits to see that people understand where the deficit comes from, what it is, to answer the questions like, well, what is it shared services? What's part of this deficit? And then to look at the idea of a rolling deficit. What does that mean? How can we move out of having that rolling deficit, which means you've collected next year's tuition in June and you've started using it to pay your bills for this year? Okay. How do we move away from that? So that's not a healthy model. And we ask you to really be bold, to look at what you're currently doing in your school and have open, honest conversations about what you do well and what you do better. Stay in touch with us. We'll be in touch with you with the planning committee. Make sure you reach out if you have questions. Before I show you how to keep in touch with us, I just want to point out, we have a meeting scheduled on the bishop's calendar for February 5th. The agenda of that meeting is still yet to be determined because we want to see what happens at the planning level, at the school level, with the planning committees, to inform that agenda. So maybe we have to bring in speakers. Maybe we have to have roundtable discussions. Maybe you have a million questions you want to answer. So we're going to work, I'm going to work in my office with the principals to sort of develop that agenda to meet the needs of the planning team. And then hopefully at that next meeting, you will have fleshed out your planning team and the room will be have twice as many people. In the meantime, where do you find more information? If you go to the website, in the top right corner, there's a little arrow that says 2020. Okay, that will take you to the letter that went out. It'll take you to the video of today's presentation. It'll take you to this PowerPoint. Our subsequent information will be there. There's also, you can just go directly to it. There's a link there. It was in that letter that went out. And then finally, well, certainly if you have questions that are regarding to get answered tonight, we'll answer them as best we can. But I know a lot of times questions don't come to mind until after you leave or until after you talk to each other. So in order to create a frequently asked questions, I'm asking everyone to send whatever questions they have, no matter how big or small, to Deborah Mitchell. Okay? And again, you'll get this email, so you don't have to write it. But you'll get the email in the PowerPoint. And what we'll do is we will create a frequently asked questions from the questions you send, and that will be on the website. All right, at this point, I'd ask, I'll ask for questions and then I'll ask Bishop to come up for his closing remarks. Not necessarily, no. Because if we do this right, and if we can find a way to better leverage resources and find a way to build enrollment in our schools, in reality it could, not the tuition would go down, but maybe the incline would be less steep. Right now, your tuitions generally go up more because you're basing it off of an enrollment number that in some cases is shrinking. have less students, you've raised tuition more. Our hope is that we can change that and, you know, it can begin to level off a bit. So that would be sort of a better, as we learn to better, or have the ability to better leverage our resources and build enrollment, hopefully that will not be the end result.
I guess a little more clarity in a sense about the local next steps. The reason why is because some of the local steps, right, some of this planning being bold, being creative, is ultimately dependent on what happens at the system-wide level. So we might make a decision that says, like, okay, we want our school to continue in this, or to adopt this particular model, but then that could be totally thrown out the window if, for example, Immaculate goes 7 to 12. So some of the decisions that we might make, or the brainstorming that we might have about what we want to happen at the local level, is dependent on the diocesan level, which won't come for another 2 months. So in some sense, just if you could offer a little more clarity on like what the conversation should look like in the interim until those diocesan decisions are made.
Right, so great question. First thing I would say is the conversation that should be had at the local level should start with the internal piece. What do we do well? And what do we not do well? And how can we improve that? Because to some degree, no matter what happens around you, if you don't answer that question, it's not going to matter. So I would say the first piece is gathering, sort of having that conversation, then gathering the information from your parents more specifically than we did. The principals will get the information from the survey, and we did share it with them at our meeting yesterday. It seems so long ago. A whole lot happened since yesterday. So the principals have seen it. We'll give them all the information if we haven't already. So they can start with that. I think that would beg more questions at the local level that you can look at. In the meantime, we met with the high school principals already. We talked to them about this idea. They will be getting back to us, I would say, fairly quickly. And then that will lead to whatever happens there will lead to further discussion, none of which is happening in September. Right? I mean, if Immaculate were to do that, they need to prepare. They need to figure out where they're going to, they need to figure that out. And that needs to be a regional conversation. What I do not want, I was the principal for 9 years of a 7 to 12 building that the Sisters of Mercy started without any dialogue with the local diocesan elementary schools. This was probably 10 years later that I was principal, and I was still trying to build bridges back to these schools who felt that you're taking our kids. Right? So we want to do this in a way that only builds partnership and builds continuity of curriculum and communication, not creates more division. So I would say, short answer is start with where you are. By the time you get all that together, develop your committee, work on what we do well, work on what we can do better, that information should start to come out of it. Again, please, if you do come up with questions, please email.
Just 2 questions? Well, that's a good sign, I hope. My friends, I want to just begin by saying how grateful I am for all the work that you have done, some of you for many, many years, to support Catholic education in our Catholic schools. For some of you, it has been Herculean, and I'm grateful, as much as I'm grateful that you're here tonight, as we begin this next chapter in the life of Catholic education. Steve, thank you for your leadership, and thank you for the excellent presentation to me and to everyone in the office, to lead in a time of challenge. And to the members of the commission who are here, many of them are here, I also thank you because you are offering this out of the goodness of your heart, many of you, to help us to lead this, bringing your expertise and your talent, and in some cases your resources. So I'm grateful. I look at the landscape of what we are dealing with sober optimism. It is sober because regardless of the schools that may be struggling individually, I am looking at a system that was created out of an immigrant church in an urban environment to bring young people from poverty into social acceptance, which is the history of the Catholic school system, now in the 21st century in a radically different landscape for all the reasons we just looked at. So the truth of the matter is, this is an exercise more than just if there are struggling schools, will they remain open for the long term? We need to look at the entire systemic process and the premises that we have accepted for 4 generations need now to be looked at in a new way. So this is a multi-year process. We're not going to be done in June by any stretch of the imagination. And that's why this call for to be creative, we really need to look at everything through a new lens. So allow me to give you some examples of the systemic challenges I see. First and foremost, when I worked for McGraw-Hill in the Gregg division, if no one wanted my product for the strengths of my product, then I was selling nothing. Luckily, Gregg, shorthand, had cornered the market. So it was an easy ask, until shorthand went out the window. I say that because one of the great systemic challenges we have is the uber secularized world we now live in. The latest statistics are that school-age parents, almost 40%, are disaffiliated from the church. So they may still be choosing Catholic education, but be disaffiliated from the church, which itself is an interesting phenomenon that we have to get our hands around. So that which we do best, which is pass on the faith, is precisely that which most parents do not value as the first or second reason of coming to a Catholic school. That's a new reality for us, right? It is a new reality. How do you meander that landscape? The demographic shifts are another. So what this tells us is for the foreseeable future, we have an overcapacity that is only going to grow. And every seat is paid for, as you know, whether there's a child in it or not, because your costs are fixed. So that is a hard discussion to have because we cannot change this birth rate around fast enough to fill in these seats for the next decade. We have excellent teachers who, because of even your heroic efforts, we cannot pay them something comparable that they could receive in the public schools. So if you are a young teacher who really loves his or her faith and would love to teach in a Catholic school, you know better than I, may not be able to raise a family in Fairfield County for very long until they find a salary that's more commensurate with what it costs to live here. That's a structural problem. Allow another one. A tuition-based education. It worked when I started school because it was $20 for the year, which wasn't like nothing, but it wasn't $7,000. And when you consider that we primarily finance our schools from the tuition we collect, that is going to be a fundamental challenge going forward as the middle class continue to experience financial duress, particularly in Fairfield County. Because those who are fairly affluent have multiple choices. And those who are poor, in the poorest of the areas, they are eligible for the Bishop Scholarship Fund, many of them. But there are a growing number of middle class, and I'm going to say working class families, who are really being squeezed. And the ideal, if I could go even further, we want to attract those families who have 2 and 3 and 4 children, who, if they paid $6,000 or $7,000 a student, we are talking beyond what a normal mortgage is in any given family. So we have built an entire system for over 120 years, right, 80 of them based on no tuition at all, because the good sisters basically built the Catholic school system. And it was the sacrifice of their lives that allowed many of us to be educated for free, which is one of the great enduring gifts given to the Catholic Church in the United States. And now with a tuition base, we are now in this position of accelerating tuition, diminishing demographics, and families that are more and more unable to afford it. So you see what I mean? This is not just a question of individual schools. This really is the one moment when we can look at the entire community of schools and begin to ask even these systemic questions. And they're going to raise many creative answers, some of which will make sense, and some of which we will try and perhaps not work. But better to have tried and not work than not to have tried at all. Let me give you an example of what I mean. The notion of a consortium. We went in this diocese from parochial schools to regional schools to diocesan schools, now to diocesan-sponsored independent schools in the academy model. But there is another model. There are many models. A consortium, whether it is anchored by a high school or whether it is through a group of elementary schools, not merging, but working together in a very close relationship so that they can leverage their resources and perhaps address each other's liabilities if they have some, including sharing different configurations of structure so that they serve a community, whatever that community is, in a non-competitive way. Because right now, we are basically, in some areas of our diocese, competitors with each other. And that is very problematic structurally. Another idea, these are just ideas that are just surfacing, is we have difficulty being able to gather those individuals who are very competent and paying them for their competence because we don't have the money. But if there were, for example, the creation of a non-for-profit, I'm going to call it personnel agency, that took it upon itself to identify a certain group of individuals, a certain task, train them, support them, give them their benefits, and through a service agreement, allow them to serve 3 days in one school, 2 days in another, so that it's not a question of agreement between schools, but there's an actually coherent way to do it across the whole system. Then that may actually save money, but it also allows people a living where they can actually live, and allows the most competent and the best prepared to help us. It also allows the possibility of positions that every school can't afford, like a development director, that a lot of schools would love to have and really can't afford to have. So my point to you, my friends, is we're starting a partnership here. We will be at this for a number of years together, to look at systemically how are we going to overcome some of these more difficult challenges that we know have been here all along, but we've never had the moment to say, we're going to do it now. And that's really what I'm grateful, is that you're willing to help me, us together, to start addressing these issues now. We've made great progress. Personalized learning and some of these other models are extraordinarily interesting. But allow me to tell you just one story that I heard last night, which I thought was fascinating. I was at a board meeting, and a gentleman on the board, when he lived in San Francisco, was a board member of a school in the inner city, or a troubled area of San Francisco. I've never been to San Francisco, and they were failing at Catholic school because they were charging a tuition that nobody fully paid. That's what Steve was talking about. So they made a bold move, and they took their tuition and cut it. And they raised their population by 140 students in one academic year, and they became viable. Because they adopted a different business model. That is, you're not going to charge what your customer can't pay, but what they do have to pay, they all pay. Another way of cutting that same cake is going to a collegiate model, which means how many students actually go to college and pay the list price of tuition? None. Because they know that's your tuition, and then there is university-based scholarships, state-based scholarships, private scholarships, work, whatever they do nowadays to work, and then that's what you pay. So that's different from a tuition that doesn't meet up. I can go on and on. Those are the conversations we have to have as a community to see what different models are we looking at systemically. So that's the sober part. The optimistic part is that God and the Lord never abandons us. When He asks us to do something, He will guide us always in our own time, in our own place, even with our own challenges to accomplish. The Lord never asks that which we cannot do. And He will always give us the grace to do it. Go out and teach all nations and baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. That is Catholic education. That is the mission of Catholic education, to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ and to bring our young people with their natural talents and supernatural gifts to heaven. That is why the schools exist. And that's why you're here, because you believe that. So don't be discouraged. Please don't. We can do this. We'll do this one step at a time. Other than that, now do you have questions? Now you must have questions. Oh, come on. Please.
Bishop, you mentioned the Catholic schools in San Francisco.
Mhm.
Reducing tuition, on a volume basis, they start to get
Right.
Have you considered, I know everybody's financial situation is
Mhm.
some years back, but have you considered, i.e., a loyalty discount for families for keeping that tuition level at certain points? We call jump off points that we've all seen. For example, the family comes in, they're there for pre-K, but then they add something.
Right.
Or they jump out. So is there something that we can say to the family, you know what, you've been with us for a certain point in time, here, the tuition's going to be investment if you stay with us. As long as you stay with us, the tuition stays with us.
Right. That's something you have to talk about in terms. I mean, that's an idea that if you discuss it locally, we bring it to a conversation when the opportunity, because there's different ways to cut this cake. You know, it's interesting, the transitional moments, so between 5th and 6th grade, between 8th and 9th grade, and between high school and college, believe it or not, are the transitional moments where young people also disaffiliate from the church. They mirror. Moments of transition are when young people, if they're disaffiliating, walk away. It's fascinating. Transition is the time when is the most precarious when it comes to life development, right? Other thoughts? So the answer is yes, we can explore that. Absolutely explore it. Yeah, everything is to be looked at. Any other thoughts? Any reactions? Are you uncomfortable? Are you anxious? Worried? Yes?
Yeah, well, I think what you're talking about is a little different than the Aquinas program, so I'm talking about both. An example of that would be the relationship that Notre Dame has with Sacred Heart University. So if you're a student in Notre Dame for 4 years, then you get automatically, I think it's 50% off tuition at Sacred Heart. So that's an example of that kind of relationship. I had a meeting at Sacred Heart the other day with the Dean of Education talking about other partnerships we would have. We have an excellent relationship with Fairfield. So I think certainly we could have some of those conversations, and I think we can look at, is there a way to talk about Catholic education pre-K to 20 and have some of those conversations. And I think the universities are willing and in some cases eager to have those conversations. In terms of the other program that Bishop mentioned, the Aquinas program, we now have a program that's funded through Foundation for Education, a grant that we received from a very generous donation that allows us to take young men and women. Right now there happens to be 3 women. They come work in our schools. We give them a stipend. They get a free master's degree. They get free housing. And they have to, at this moment, the way it's designed is they then get back 2 years after that. They have to work in the schools at full salary then. They would work in the schools for 2 years following that. So we're trying new and different ways. We created the Leadership Academy that's in its first year. We have our first cohort of teachers who are through Fordham University getting their school building leadership certification. And the way that partnership works is the university gives a discount. We pay, I think it's 25%, off the top of my head, I think that's the number, and then they pay the rest, which is about, ends up being about 25%. And that is one of the ways that we hope to keep people engaged in our schools and help them to see that they have a future. Our other hope is if we can build the population of schools, that we can also create a leadership plan for teachers. Right now, one of the challenges we have, because most of our schools are small, we don't have assistant principals or those kind of positions. So there isn't really a training ground. So if you want to take a Catholic school teacher who's committed to the mission and wants to move into leadership, we don't have that intermediate training ground really well defined. So that's what we're trying to work on for this cohort group. So a lot of times they go from teaching in the classroom to running the chefs. The next cohort of Aquinas fellows, yes. You get the application through our website.
And it's being hosted, I believe, at St. Gregory Parish.
Yes, they live actually in a very nice, newly renovated convent. They did a great job renovating this, and we rent the building from the parish, and that's where the 3 of them live. 2 of them are teachers, 1 is a social worker. What we're trying to do, and we originally were only doing teachers, but we decided to accept the social worker because one of the ideas we had is could we train the social worker and create a social work program where we hire a social worker, kind of like a shared service, and they share a couple of different elementary schools. Because most elementary schools, where they might need them, can't always afford them.
Is there a segment on the commission that will challenge and educate the pastors of all of the parishes in the diocese that specifically do not have a dog in the fight? There was a period of time when we all collaborated, we all contributed together with the free nuns and many of the free priests that were working in our school system. But now, if we're trying to have a viable Catholic faith and we're wondering why they don't come to church and why we don't do all these other things, if we can't get engaged the pastors of all of the parishes to have skin in the game, then the commission should look at that as well. We definitely have to have best practices. We have to improve the way we waste or not waste. We want to educate our teachers and pay them a fair amount, but we have to have buy-in by the pastors. And I think the commission should focus on that at least in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, and I can answer part of that, and then if you want to add to it, part of that leadership committee, part of what they're looking at is how do we do a better job of engaging the pastors. We have, in some cases, we have, you can see here, we have some pastors here, and in some of the schools I've walked into, the pastors are there when I come, and they're very engaged, and they do what they can, even if they're a one-man show, they do what they can to support the school. So we are blessed with a number of really terrific pastors. But one of the things I think we have to do on our part is to better engage them and to reach out, not just to the ones that host our schools, but as you said, to reach out beyond that. And I think part of it is incumbent upon us to re-engage. And I think, and I wasn't here, I've only been here, this is my 4th year in the diocese, I think that at some period in history, when there was a movement from parish schools to diocesan schools, that disengagement that happened, I think we're still suffering from that. And so it's really incumbent upon us in our office and the principals to do some of that outreach. Those are some of the conversations happening at that leadership committee.
I would just add, Bill, I would say what Steve just mentioned is a very important point. That many pastors, when we went to diocesan structure, were very much disenfranchised. And in some cases were very much told they were not welcome in school. So that was an error that was very unfortunate in my estimation. But to re-engage them, there is an ambivalence in some pastors. And just to give you the context, because again, they're serving all of their people in their parish. By our best estimates, we have about 26,000 students in religious education, and we have roughly 8,000 schools. When you look at diocesan resources, just that number, whatever that number was, 8 million, whatever, and just in the money that's raised, Holly is here through Foundations in Education. Holly does a phenomenal job of $2.5 million worth of aid. If that didn't exist, this would be a crisis. So I thank you for your leadership as well. But when you look at the resources we're generating for this, some pastors have ambivalence because there is no direct, significant diocesan aid for religious education. And there are stresses and strains there. So I'm not suggesting that's a reason they not be engaged, but I think to Steve's point, we have to re-invite them and give them a meaningful role in the schools again. We have to give them a meaningful role in the schools again, so that there is co-ownership, co-responsibility, right? And we have to think that through systematically what that means, right? Any other thoughts? Questions, please? Oh, absolutely. Excellent idea.
You mentioned five group, 5 group. I'm not quite sure. Is there any look at maybe elementary schools that they have teachers that would maybe like to retire or maybe an incentive to retire and diocese as well as principal echo that kind of something at all? Teachers that if given a particular
Oh, I'll take that one. Okay. We have to, I think we have to be quite wise and deliberate when we look at our school personnel and run into the temptation of quantifying that personnel. And let me tell you why I say that. We are in a generational shift. And many of our young teachers might be professional educators, but they are also in an environment, growing up in forms where they may be somewhat ambivalent of their Catholic faith. They may not have a full understanding of their faith. They may have an ambivalent relationship with the church. My experience has been our older teachers who have been teaching for a very long time, in an earlier time in us, those issues are not there. So because they've lasted all this long, they believe in the mission, because they didn't stay for the money, they stayed for the mission. Right? And they love what they do and they love their kids. So I think it's a dangerous road to go in my humility, because it's almost penny wise and pound foolish. We are not just educators, we are formators. And it's attitude, and it's action, and it's example, and it's witness that forms, besides that which we teach intellectually in the faith. So, I'm not giving you a direct answer, but it's one of my concerns when I look at school structure. Because yeah, a much younger faculty is not as expensive, but there's much lost in that too. Exactly. Exactly right. Right. Exactly. Exactly. Okay. Last question. Is there a last question? Oh, there isn't. All right, my friends. So this is your homework. do everything he said, and pray. Now, I'm not being foolish. I mean it. Every single day, whenever you take time in your day to pray, whenever it is, please pray intentionally for the discernment of the Holy Spirit in this process. Because the solution exists, Christ knows it, and wants to tell us. I believe that with all my heart. It's a question of us attuning, listening, using our collective wisdom and talent to try to understand what that is, and then have the courage to do it. So we need the grace of the Holy Spirit. We need the Lord to help us. So please do that every day. And I will. And you are all in my prayers every day. So I promise to do that. So. That's it. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Father, we have come to the end of this day. We lift up to you with grateful hearts all that we've accomplished, all that we've done, all that we desire to do for your glory and honor. Continue to send your Holy Spirit upon us in our weaknesses and in our challenges, for we trust in you. We have confidence in you. We will do whatever you ask of us. Bless this work we have begun, for it is a daunting challenge that with you and only with you can we find our safe passage forward. So as we leave this place, allow us to travel safely back home, to pass this night in your love, and with the rising of the sun, give you honor and glory through Christ our Lord. And may Almighty God bless you, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Thank you, my friends. I will see you February 5th. Thank you.